24 U.S. bombers penetrate Iranian airspace simultaneously, and in 63 minutes, every hardened military airfield, every dispersal base, and every forward-deployed combat aircraft Iran possesses is burning. 31,000 feet above the eastern Mediterranean, 8 B-52H Stratofortresses, each carrying 20 AGM-86C conventionally armed cruise missiles, flew in staggered trail formation, invisible on civilian radar, broadcasting no transponders, under tactical emission control since departing Diego Garcia 14 hours earlier. To the south, 8 B-1B Lancers from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar had been airborne for 2 hours and 40 minutes, loaded with AGM-158B JASSM-ER cruise missiles, 1,000-kilometer standoff range, penetrating warheads designed to defeat hardened aircraft shelters. And from the west, crossing Iranian airspace already, 8 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers descending toward their release altitudes over the Caspian approach corridor, each carrying 16 GBU-31J DAM precision bombs and 4 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators for the underground facilities that required something heavier than a precision impact. 24 bombers, 672 weapons. Time to coordinated release, 43 minutes. The target list contained 84 aim points across 9 target sets. Iranian Air Force main operating bases, 6. Forward operating bases used for dispersal, 8. Underground hardened aircraft shelters rated against conventional munitions, 22. Above-ground hardened shelters, 31. Fuel and maintenance facilities, 11. Air Force command and radar nodes, 6. 84 aim points, 672 weapons. The math gave every target an average of 8 weapons, calibrated precisely to the shelter hardening ratings and facility vulnerability analysis that the Defense Intelligence Agency had spent 6 years refining. The operation was triggered not by a single provocation, but by the cumulative failure of a coercive strategy running 17 months without behavioral change. Iran's Air Force, aging F-14 Tomcats and F-4 Phantoms, supplemented by Russian Su-35s and Chinese J-10CE fighters acquired through sanctions-evading transfers, had spent those 17 months conducting increasingly aggressive intercepts of U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, harassing maritime patrol operations, and providing air cover for IRGC-N fast attack operations that damaged 4 commercial vessels and 1 U.S. warship. Each intercept had been met with diplomatic protest and economic sanction. Iran's Air Force commanders had correctly assessed each response as a boundary being tested. The assessment was accurate until it wasn't. What's your assessment? Type A if you believe targeting Iran's Air Force, aircraft, shelters, and bases, rather than nuclear infrastructure, was the correct operational priority given 17 months of aviation escalation. Type C if you believe the Air Force strike addressed symptoms rather than causes, and nuclear infrastructure should have been primary. Drop your full tactical analysis in the comments. The coordination challenge was the most complex air operation the United States had attempted since the opening night of Desert Storm in 1991. 24 aircraft from 3 separate approach corridors separated by thousands of kilometers, converging on 84 targets in a 13-minute window. The solution was not real-time command. That creates single points of failure. The solution was pre-briefed time-on-target sequencing. Every crew knew their specific target coordinates, their release window measured to the second, and every contingency. The briefing ran 6 hours and 40 minutes via secure video conference across Diego Garcia, Al Udeid, and Whiteman Air Force Base simultaneously. By the time aircraft were airborne, the operation was running on internal discipline and preset timing. The headquarters monitored. The crews executed. Subscribe and hit the bell. This depth of operational analysis runs every week. Iranian air defense had been at heightened alert for 9 days, not from specific intelligence about the incoming strike, but following a U.S. naval buildup that Iranian commanders had assessed as potentially preceding a limited IRGC-N facility strike. Heightened alert meant radar operators awake, intercept crews at their aircraft, surface-to-air missiles in active tracking mode. It also meant that when weapons began arriving, the Iranian response would be faster than from a cold start. None of that mattered for the B-2s. The B-2's radar cross-section of approximately 0.1 square meters, compared to a conventional bomber's 10 to 100 square meters, meant Iranian radar systems capable of detecting a conventional aircraft at 250 kilometers could not reliably track a B-2 until inside 30 kilometers. At 30 kilometers, the weapons were already in freefall with GPS guidance fins locked. By the time Iranian operators could transmit a track and get a missile to launch authorization, the weapons were in terminal descent. The B-2s were never engaged with a valid targeting solution. 8 aircraft flew through Iranian airspace and back out without a single intercept attempt that had firing quality radar lock. The B-1Bs never entered Iranian airspace at all. The JASSM-ER's 1,000-kilometer range allowed release from positions over the Gulf of Oman and Northern Arabian Sea, entirely outside Iranian air defense engagement envelopes. The JASSM-ER flies terrain following at low altitude, with a radar cross-section of approximately 0.1 square meters, designed to penetrate layered defenses by flying below radar horizon coverage. Iranian radars looking for high-altitude threats saw nothing. Iranian radars detecting low-altitude threats found 128 JASSM-ER signatures at ranges too short for reliable intercept. 22 intercept attempts were made. 14 failed. The JASSM-ER's maneuverability in terminal phase producing missed distances outside lethal radius. 8 were destroyed. 120 missiles reached their aim points. The B-52s never approached Iranian airspace. From the Mediterranean and Northern Arabian Sea, their AGM-86C cruise missiles entered from a bearing that exploited the gap opened by the B-2 and JASSM-ER first waves. The AGM-86C is older and subsonic. Iranian radar could detect it at range. But arriving as the third simultaneous stream forced Iranian operators to prioritize multiple threat tracks concurrently. A radar operator tracking B-2 JDAMs in terminal descent, JASSM-ERs from the south, and AGM-86Cs from the west cannot track any of them with intercept quality precision. 19 AGM-86Cs were intercepted. 141 reached their targets. The combined package, 128 B-2 precision bombs, 120 JASSM-ERs, 141 AGM-86Cs, struck the 84 aim points across a 13-minute window from 12:34 to 12:47 a.m. Sequencing was deliberate. B-2 GBU-57 impacts on underground hardened shelters came first at 12:34 a.m., collapsing facilities where dispersed aircraft had been sheltered. JASSM-ER strikes on above-ground shelters and main base infrastructure ran from 12:36 to 12:42 a.m. AGM-86C strikes on fuel storage, maintenance facilities, and command nodes ran from 12:40 to 12:47 a.m., targeting infrastructure that would have supported any aircraft surviving the first 2 waves. The sequencing answered a single targeting question: in what order do we destroy these elements to ensure nothing survives and nothing can be reconstituted quickly? What would you have ordered as the Iranian Air Force commander at 12:34 a.m. when underground shelter collapses are registering on seismic monitors, JASSM-ER impacts are appearing across the main base network, and airborne patrols are reporting cruise missile tracks from 3 bearings simultaneously? Launch every remaining aircraft immediately to save them from ground destruction? Hold them in dispersal positions not yet struck? Or order emergency dispersal to civilian airports that U.S. rules of engagement would theoretically prohibit striking? Leave your decision in the comments. Iran's response was constrained by a structural problem the attack timing had been deliberately designed to exploit. Iranian Air Force doctrine requires aircraft airborne within 8 minutes of attack warning, derived from Israeli Air Force Analysis Incorporated after the 1967 and 1973 wars. 8 minutes. The warning Iranian bases received from radar detecting B-2 terminal approach tracks and JASSM-ER signatures came at 12:31 a.m., 3 minutes before first impact. 3 minutes is not enough time to execute an 8-minute protocol. 19 Iranian combat aircraft got airborne in the 3-minute window and the immediate post-impact confusion. 19 out of approximately 240 combat-coded airframes in the Iranian Air Force inventory The remaining 221 were destroyed in shelters, destroyed on flight lines, or rendered non-operational by the destruction of maintenance facilities and fuel infrastructure sustaining them. The 19 airborne aircraft immediately faced U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornets from Carrier Air Wing 3. 16 aircraft armed with AIM-100D AMRAAM beyond visual range missiles, pre-positioned on combat air patrol tracks east of the Strait of Hormuz, briefed that any Iranian aircraft airborne during the strike window would be engaged under Hostile Act rules of engagement. 11 Iranian aircraft were shot down. 8 pilots ejected and survived. 3 did not. The remaining 8 Iranian aircraft landed at 3 airfields not on the primary target list. Intact runways, functioning fuel. 8 aircraft out of 240. The Iranian Air Force that had been harassing American reconnaissance operations for 17 months had been reduced to single figures before dawn. Post-strike satellite imagery assessed at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency between 1 and 4 a.m. produced the numbers that defined strategic discussion for months. 63 of 84 aim points assessed as destroyed or severely damaged. Facility destruction complete, target non-functional. 17 assessed as moderately damaged, degraded but potentially repairable in weeks rather than months. 4 produced inconclusive results due to cloud cover or secondary fire interference obscuring post-strike imagery. Against the 8 aircraft that survived, the Iranian Air Force's operational capacity had been reduced by an estimated 96% in a 13-minute window. The fuel infrastructure loss alone, 9 of 11 fuel storage facilities destroyed, meant the 8 surviving aircraft had enough fuel for approximately 11 days of operations at peacetime training rates before their hosts ran dry. The strategic aftermath developed faster than any crisis management protocol was designed to handle. Iranian state television went dark at 12:51 a.m., 11 minutes after the last weapon impact, and remained dark for 4 hours and 17 minutes before resuming with emergency broadcasts that contained no mention of the strikes. Iranian government communications shifted to backup channels that U.S. signals intelligence had full coverage of within 40 minutes of the primary network going down. The picture that assembled from those intercepts over the following 2 hours was of a government in genuine shock. Not performing shock for a diplomatic audience, but processing the actual destruction of a military capability that Iranian political leadership had been repeatedly assured was hardened, dispersed, and survivable against American conventional strike. It was hardened. It was dispersed. It was not survivable against 24 bombers operating with 6 years of targeting analysis, pre-briefed time-on-target sequencing, and 3 simultaneous approach corridors exploiting a partially degraded air defense network from directions Iranian planners had not fully wargamed as a combined threat axis. The hardening calculations had been made against single-axis attack profiles using weapons available in 2018. The attack that arrived in the early hours of Monday morning used weapons, routes, and sequencing that had been specifically designed to defeat those hardening calculations. 6 years of deliberate targeting work against a facility hardening program that had not been updated to account for what 6 years of American weapons development had produced. The Iranian Air Force did not fly combat operations for the next 11 days. Not because the 8 surviving aircraft were incapable, they were maintained, fueled from emergency reserves, and their crews were alive. They did not fly because Iranian Air Force Command assessed that flying 8 aircraft against an American carrier, air wing of 90 aircraft, with Aegis ships and THAAD batteries providing layered defense of every base those 8 aircraft might use, would produce 8 more destroyed aircraft and 8 more crew deaths without changing any operational reality. The rational decision was the same one the Supreme Leader had made 42 minutes after the previous night's strike. Preserve what remained rather than expend it on a gesture. The deeper lesson from the 63-minute operation is not about air power or stealth or cruise missiles. It is about the gap between what a military force believes about its own survivability and what happens when that belief is tested by a targeting architecture that has been studying the gap for 6 years. Iranian Air Force commanders had briefed their political leadership that their hardened shelters could survive American conventional strikes. They were right about the shelters they had characterized. They had not been briefed because the intelligence community had not detected it, that American targeting analysis had identified 17 specific geological and structural vulnerabilities in the underground facilities that allowed GBU-57 internal collapse sequences to defeat shelter hardening without requiring direct penetration of the full overhead protection. The shelters survived the weapons that hit them from the outside. They did not survive the wave propagation generated by the weapons that hit the specific structural nodes identified in 6 years of geophysical analysis. The commanders believed their shelters were hardened. The shelters were hardened. The targeting had found the seam between hardened and survivable and put weapons precisely in it. That is the lesson that every military watching this operation from the outside absorbed before the sun rose on Tuesday morning. Hardening is a fixed investment made at a point in time against a threat environment characterized at that time. Targeting is a continuous process that studies the hardening and designs the defeat. When the targeting is 6 years ahead of the hardening assessment, the hardening holds and the facility collapses anyway. The gap between those two outcomes is invisible from the outside. It is only visible at 12:34 a.m. when the seismic monitors register the underground collapse of a facility whose political patrons had been assured it was safe. The 8 aircraft that survived are not the story. The 232 that did not are not the story either. The story is the 6 years of patient, methodical, classified work that identified 17 structural vulnerabilities in hardened underground facilities and designed 4 weapons sequencing to exploit each one, conducted entirely out of public view, funded in budget lines that do not appear in news coverage, executed by analysts whose names appear in no article about the operation. The 63 minutes were the visible product. The 6 years were the actual weapon. To every Air Force in every country that has invested in hardened shelters and dispersal bases as protection against American conventional strike, the targeting process does not stop when your shelters are built. It starts, and it does not announce itself. Was the Iranian Air Force's 17-month escalation pattern, harassing reconnaissance, covering IRGCN operations, testing U.S. response thresholds, a rational coercive strategy that simply encountered a response architecture it had underestimated? Or was the escalation a structural consequence of a military that had been telling its political leadership that its capabilities were more survivable than targeting analysis could support? And what does the 8 aircraft survival rate, 3.3% of the combat-coded inventory, tell us about the gap between hardened shelter investment and the targeting development that studies it? Like the video if this level of analysis is what you came here for. Subscribe, hit the bell, and leave your tactical read on the 63-minute operation in the comments. The next scenario is already in production. There is a metric from the 63-minute operation that will appear in every future air power study on hardened facility defeat. Not because it is the most dramatic number, but because it is the most precisely diagnostic. It is the difference between the shelter hardening standard, rated to defeat a direct GBU-28 bunker buster impact on the overhead protection, and the actual defeat mechanism employed on the night of the strike. Not a single GBU-57 impacted the overhead protection of a hardened underground shelter. Every GBU-57 impacted a lateral structural node, a load-bearing interface point in the underground architecture where the facility's weight transfer geometry concentrated stress in a way that wave propagation could amplify into progressive structural collapse. The shelters were never hit on their strongest point. They were hit on points their designers had not characterized as vulnerabilities, because the geophysical modeling required to identify those points as exploitable had not existed when the shelters were built. The hardening was real. The defeat mechanism bypassed the hardening entirely. That distinction between defeating a protection and bypassing it is the operational concept that 63 minutes demonstrated in practice for the first time in combat. It will not be the last time. The next hardened facility in the next contested region is already being characterized by the same process that characterized these. The targeting does not rest between operations. It runs continuously, looking for the load-bearing node that the facility's designers did not think to harden because they did not know it needed to be. The 63 minutes ended. The characterization of the next target continued. That is the arithmetic of a military that has been at this work for 6 years without pause. The Iranian Air Force that spent 17 months harassing American reconnaissance aircraft, calculating that each intercept was a boundary being tested rather than a line being enforced, was correct in that calculation for 16 of those months. In month 17, the calculation remained correct. The line had been tested, it had been found, and the response it produced was not a diplomatic protest or an economic sanction. It was 24 bombers, 672 weapons, and 6 years of work that turned a 13-minute window into a permanent change in the regional balance of air power. The boundary was real. The enforcement architecture behind it had been built while the testing was happening. Every intercept, every harassment operation, every cover mission for an IRGC fast attack boat had been entered into the evidence base that justified the strike authorization. The authorization was not made in a moment of crisis. It was made at the end of a body of evidence that had been accumulating for 17 months. The bombers were already fueled. The target packages were already loaded. The time on target schedules were already computed. The only thing missing was the authorization code transmitted in 847 bytes at 11:51 p.m. on a Monday. The Iranian Air Force provided the last piece of evidence that justified that code 4 days before the bombers flew. The code was transmitted, the bombers flew, the math resolved. 8 aircraft out of 240, 3%. That is what 17 months of testing a line that had already been crossed produces when the enforcement architecture finally activates. History does not grade escalation strategies on their internal logic. It grades them on their outcomes. The Iranian Air Force's internal logic was sound. Test the boundary incrementally, absorb the diplomatic costs, build leverage through demonstrated capability, and wait for American political tolerance to produce a negotiated ceiling. The outcome was 63 minutes and 3%. The logic was not the problem. The targeting architecture it was being tested against was the problem. And the targeting architecture does not appear in any diplomatic cable, any sanctions list, or any public statement of American resolve. It appears at 12:34 a.m. when the seismic monitors register. By then, the logic is irrelevant.